Africa's Future. Welcome back to the course. We've spent a lot of time discussing Africa and its politics, and we need to start thinking about where all of this leads. We've lamented at great length, in fact, that there's a liberation leadership, an independence leadership, which has not yet completely disappeared from the scene. And they carry with them ideas that animated them as they were fighting for independence. Is this the kind of thinking, the style of thinking that is needed for the future? Can you think into the future based only on the past? If there's to be a mix of past lessons and future aspirations, what is the role of technology in all of this? Now, a lot of what should be a very, very profound and detailed and complex debate gets submerged in sound bites and tropes. We use terms like decolonization. What does it mean? Now, in fact, the term decolonization has an interesting history. You can probably trace its genealogy back to 1984, when Ngugi wa Thiong'o rehearsed what became his great book, Decolonizing the Mind. Now, in fact, it had a very unlikely genesis in 1984 as the Douglas Robb lectures at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, a most unlikely venue. And in fact, that particular lecture series was arranged by my two former English literature tutors, Michael Neal and Sebastian Black, and I was living and working in Zambia at the time. And they wrote to me and said, look, we've got this crazy idea. Do you think it could work? And I said, by all means, try to make this work. So they managed to persuade, with some great effort, the University of Auckland authorities to host a very prestigious lecture series. And Ngugi came and gave this amazing rendition, this amazing critique of how the past had been shaped by colonialism and how the only way forward was to work towards a decolonization, but in one's own language. In other words, his premise was that as long as you're using the colonizer's language, you're going to be thinking along the lines of the colonizer. Only by thinking in your own language and thereby using your own conceptual apparatus, and this is the key thing, it's not just speaking, it's thinking. Only when you have an authenticity, as it were, in terms of thought, can you have the prospect of going forward into the future. There was one step back and 2, 3, hopefully more steps forward. Many people forget about the need for all of these steps forward. And of course, you had a real problem in terms of Ngugi's proposition. He himself lived up to his word. He was good as word. And basically, from that day on, he wrote in Kikuyu, despite the fact that before then he had been essentially a world-famous author writing in English. His books since then have been translated into English, but the text that he produces is Kikuyu. Now, the problematic nature of all of this is, to whom does his authenticity speak when it's expressed in Kikuyu? It certainly doesn't speak to everybody in Kenya itself, the modern state of Kenya, which has got several major languages, Luo being among them, Swahili being another. Does this being able to think for oneself in one's own language in fact create a ghetto of non-communication with others who might wish to communicate? Does it create an isolationism in the world at large? So that if one is progressing towards the future, and this means taking some kind of command of globalization as it affects you, then do you not just become an enclave subject to globalization and all of its vicissitudes? And how do you express scientific subjects? How do you do modern technological subjects when an earlier Kikuyu vocabulary does not exist for many of the things which are essential conceptual terms and basic ways forward in terms of articulating science. In other words, to decolonize, you really have to do not only a good step backwards, you actually have to, in going backwards, recreate or create afresh all kinds of things so that you can go forward. And many people, in wanting to decolonize, don't really contemplate the steps that are required to be created in order to go forward. And what does decolonization mean anyway? To what are you decolonizing? What was there in the past that you wish to reach again? A way of thinking, well, do we know exactly how people thought, particularly in cultures with a lack of written language, and therefore a lack of recorded debate? We've already discussed this in class. There's a problematique there as well. But if you're going to rely on oral histories, then you've got contention. We discussed last week, for instance, thought on gender equality. We discussed thought on equality between heterosexual and homosexual people, trans people. If one simply is going to be in an assertive competition, and you assert that in African past histories, there's no such thing as homosexuality, and then someone else asserts, but no, there were indeed instances of homosexuality. Who wins the decolonial debate? Do you simply have the strongest and politically most astute and powerful assertion about homosexuality, for instance? And because it did not, therefore, exist in the past, because of the power of assertion and the politicization of assertion, it can't exist in society today. Well, that is not a means of arguing towards equality, and particularly when it comes to things like women's rights, all kinds of things, as Thomas Sankara did, need to be grasped in their modern concept to facilitate the practice of modern development. Whereas we discussed, women hold up half the sky, and this has got to be recognized in terms of technological availability and technological equality. That very, very essence of equality in technological terms and in developmental terms never existed in the past. And it's not just Africa. You can have instances all around the world. To what is President Xi in China decolonizing? Is he decolonizing away from Western domination and Western globalization to a glorious Chinese past in which he himself seems to be assuming the same kind of powers as a feudal Chinese emperor? Is that what you're heading for? Not just the good things of the past, but also the very baleful and very, very bad things of the past. What about democracy, pluralism, diversity, the right to choose? Are all of those things also going to be neglected in a headlong rush to go backwards? And what about constitutional provision? People like Mamdani wrote about the distinction between citizen and subject, how the colonizers reduced people to subjects, but it was modern constitutionalism that made them into citizens of independent countries. Without modern constitutionalism, as pioneered, for instance, in France, revolutionary France and Napoleonic France, the concept of the modern citizen would not exist. And if Europe wanted to decolonize itself from itself, would it go back also to a feudal past? Or would it take, as in the Napoleonic era, new forms of social arrangement and political arrangement to go forward into the future with ideas of emancipation, ideas that basically heralded what we regard and take for granted as modernity? If you decolonize, can you also be modern? Is the key question here. And it's a difficult one. And of course, what you have is not only this idea of decolonization as a generality. At what point Do you stop the decolonization in terms of looking backwards to the past? In Zambia, for instance, which is now constitutionally declared as a Christian nation, do you go beyond that moment of its becoming subject to, immersed within, and free to adopt Christianity as the basic religious ethos, the foundational ethos of an entire country, an otherwise modern state? If you go back beyond that, what is the unifying force in a state with 72 different, let us say, decolonial nationalities? So the problems are very, very great. And of course, they become greater the more you look at global examples. Is radical Islamic jihadism, for instance, a form of decolonization, casting off the shackles of the secular West? Or is it something which is anti-progressive, anti-modern, anti-equality, anti-peaceful coexistence, all of these things, doctrinaire instead, dominating, and basically intending to be violent to achieve its ends? Yet it could be very, very possibly suggested that this is a form of decolonial endeavor. So one must take care. One must not use lazy terms. And similarly, what you've got is the use in a reasonably lazy, and I use that word advisedly, the lazy use of key thinkers in the struggle for independence. A lot of people claim to have read Frantz Fanon, whether they have or not, or whether they never really got past Jean-Paul Sartre's lengthy preface to his book, The Wretched of the Earth, Les Damnés de la Terre. That's another question. But Fanon, who was born in Martinique, French, Caribbean territory at that point in time, studied in France, fell into the philosophical circles of people like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, etc., trained and qualified as both a doctor and as a psychiatrist, began writing in French, and adopted the Algerian struggle for independence from France as his great cause, not before he himself fought for France in World War II, was wounded, was decorated, was regarded as a heroic fighter for France. So what values was he fighting for, or was he fighting against the values of fascism? So when you express yourself as being in favor of decolonialism, what part of the colonial project are you seeking to move away from? If you have fascism on the one hand, communism on another hand, some kind of democratic liberalism on the other hand, are they all the same thing? And no, they're not. So the differentiation that is required is something which should also be brought to a modern day critique and interrogation of what Fanon stood for. And in adopting the Algerian cause and supporting the FLN, the liberation movement of Algeria, what Fanon seemed to be doing was to endorse the violence of the oppressed in order to meet and to overcome the violence of the oppressor. Now, this particular fundamental but simple reading has been critiqued by Akil Mbembe in his own recent great book, Critique of Black Reason. Now, in fact, this book sets out very obviously to be a response to the kind of European-dominated thought, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Dialectical Reason, for instance. It's a riff off that particular title to suggest that Black thought has its own values. And Fanon is one of his key examples. But two things about Fanon, and I've written about this myself. What you have in terms of the proposition of violence is not only a means of addressing violence perpetrated against yourself, you reply in kind, you reply violently to violence being perpetrated upon you, but you're also exorcising a certain degree of trauma that has been caused to you. There's an equalization not only of violence, but an equalization of trauma. This makes stuff very, very complicated now. And it was very, very much something ameliorated in action. Now, on trauma, first of all, we read a very great deal of The Wretched of the Earth. These are case studies. This is a psychiatrist at work studying the effects of trauma upon Algerian people who had been subjugated by the French. Fanon wishes that kind of imposition of trauma to end. And the amelioration of violence in turn and trauma in turn was seen in the field in terms of the struggle put up by the Algerian freedom fighters. And Mbembe, Akil Mbembe is good at pointing this out. Not only were the freedom fighters adept at committing violence, sometimes quite savage violence, sometimes quite atrocious violence, and they were responded to in kind. There was a spiral escalation on both sides. But whereas captured freedom fighters would be executed by the French, even if they were sick, wounded, in need of care, they didn't get any of that. They simply got summarily executed. Whereas wounded French soldiers, if they were discovered by the Algerian freedom fighters, were taken to rebel hospitals and treated kindly, treated humanely. So what Mbembe is saying is that the true appreciation of Fanon is to be able to decipher that there were two sides to what it was that he was saying. For violence, there's a reverse decor. That reverse decor is one of mercy. That condition of mercy allows a positive view of the future. It does not mean a continued view only of the past and its traumas. It is a means of recovery, a mode of recovery, a foundation for a future in which there has to be international, global cooperation, even between the new independent state and the former colonizing state. This is something which, as I said, is often overlooked, but Mbembe makes this very, very clear. That's his interpretation of what was going on. So that you have, in the way that many thinkers are looking at the world, a sense of wanting to decouple from the hegemony of the West. Samir Amin, the famous Egyptian thinker, who made his mark with think tanks emanating from Senegal, the Codesria network, for instance, which basically established in Africa in the 1960s and onwards a golden triangle with Senegal, Dakar, Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, and later Harare in Zimbabwe, a golden triangle of thought, neo-Marxist, committed to the idea of being truly independent of the West, but also committed to the idea that modernity, even so, was something that had to be struggled for in order for a true independence to be able to be wrought. In other words, you can't be independent, be primitive and dependent at the same time on capital flows, material flows, and technological flows from the West, or from the East for that matter, from China. If you've got to go it by yourself, you've got to be able to do it for yourself. So that nuancing how we go forward from dominant capitalism, for instance, to a new world system means a future for Africa, which is a future embedded in the project of creating a new world system. So there's nothing isolationist about the future of Africa when seen in those terms. It's not revanchist. It's not going backwards for the sake of going backwards. It's creating something by which Africa could go forward and also lead. Now, this means also, as Mbembe was suggesting in his work, so that's why his book is called Critique of Black Reason. It means taking the project of Ngugi wa Thiong'o forward, not just writing in your own language, but articulating how you think, and articulating that in many languages. In other words, you've got to articulate how you think in metropolitan languages as well, so that you can say to the world at large, this is how we are equal. Our thought is every bit as complex as your thought. And that's a project which has been taken up quite recently by a number of writers, but one whom I greatly admire is Bello, Gatsheni, and Lovu. He's written a series of books now. It's a never-ending series, it seems. Not all of them are good, and some of them are repetitive. But he proposes, in the best of them, an epistemic freedom for Africa. That is, you're not chained down to someone's epistemology, but you're able to put forward your own epistemology, your own methodology of truth and logical reasoning towards why it should be regarded as truth. You're able to do that, and you're able to do that independently of epistemic impositions from the outside. Now, there are a number of contradictions, not only in Gatsheni and Lovu's work, but also in the work of great writers working in French language, in fact, people like Mudimbe, Valentine Mudimbe. This great book on an African gnosis, a hidden knowledge which is yet to fully appear, to be fully unveiled to Africa itself, never mind the rest of the world. When you look at his work, when you look at the work of the great French intellectual Diop, when you look at Gatsheni and Lovu's work, when you look at Mbembe's work, you're looking at work which basically uses as part of its apparatus the work of European thinkers, particularly French thinkers. In other words, the philosophical impact of the West, of Europe, particularly of France, is profound. And there's a reason why it's profound. And that is because precisely the French Revolution, 1789, and the Napoleonic constitutional revolutions that followed, going forward to create the new citizen, and it was to become this kind of new citizen that campaigns for independence were waged all across Africa, to constitutionalize the idea of being a citizen rather than being unconstitutionally treated as a subject by colonial powers, to go forward was something that was very powerfully articulated in the thought of France from the 1800s onwards. So that people claiming that they're proposing an epistemic freedom, an epistemic independence for Africa, basically are trying to say something which is in fact more complicated than it seems to be the case when first looked at. And that is, they are proposing a globalization of freedom in which metropolitan thought from, for instance, France, is laid alongside thought that emanates from Africa, using styles and methodologies of thought which, in the first instance, have got to be explained to the metropolitan world, and which have to be explained in such a way that even the affiliation to, for instance, French philosophy can be seen as simply a means to introduce the affiliation of Africa to its own philosophies. So the project, intellectually speaking, is immense. And if speaking to Western thought, how do you speak also to Chinese thought? You know, it's the great rising superpower of the world. Billions of people speak it. And is there a dominant African language that can compete in terms of the multiplicity of people who are speaking it? It's not Kikuyu. If you're going to choose one, it's Hausa. In Nigeria, 18 million speakers. But no one in Africa outside of Nigeria, or in fact even outside that part of Nigeria that speaks Hausa, is going to say, let's adopt Hausa as our universal language. So one basically is confronted with the question of language, what it means to whom, how it functions not only in the nation state, but in the world, and how it meets the conditionality of the world, which is imposed upon the quest for equality. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's the intellectual project, and it's a much harder intellectual project than seems to be the case. You can't go backwards, you've got to go forward, and it's not easy. To what do you go forward? I've labored this many, many times. You go forward, as I say, to simply a statement of something from the past. Even if you're just going to a recent past, like the endless reference to the liberation war in Zimbabwe, for instance, the generation of the 1970s leading to independence in the 1980s, has never stopped using what was called the Second Chimurenga War of Liberation as a foundational cornerstone, as a trope almost. And future thought, future constitutional development leading to genuine political equality and political pluralism is anchored in a refusal to go beyond the fact that one party dominated the elections after the War of Independence. So going forward means accepting risk. But what you have in Zimbabwe is, I think, just yesterday announced that it was the 144th unhappiest country on earth out of a list of 146. I think only Lebanon and, yes, of course, Afghanistan come underneath Zimbabwe. So what you have in the style of thought and the style of administration that has never gone beyond the recent past to do with liberation from colonialism, from white settledom. What you have is a lack of economic production, which requires modernity. What you have is a lack of pharmaceutical capacity, so they've been totally dependent on the Chinese for pharmaceutical assistance, for vaccines against COVID, for instance. Absolutely dependent, no capacity to manufacture, assemble, or even bargain with other providers of vaccines on the kind of basis that would be favorable to Zimbabwean health. A health sector, in fact, that's degenerating. A vice president who's also been Minister of Health, who was also an army general, who thinks that doctors and nurses can be commanded as if they were soldiers on a battlefield. Fired all the teachers too, as if that could be commanded. In other words, the nuances of modern development, particularly in specialist sectors, is not something that can be guaranteed to go forward by reference to a political past, which is in fact quite recent. Being able to understand medical advances, being able to understand educational advances is key. That's why perhaps someone like Cabral, in fighting for independence of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, and becoming a friend and an ally of Fidel Castro's Cuba, pretty much was more perceptive than what many people give him credit for. Everyone refers to the debate as to how much of a Marxist he was, a crypto-Marxist, a pragmatic Marxist, a neo-Marxist, a neo-Marxist. But he appreciated what Castro had done by way of medicine and by way of education. For decade after decade, it was Cuba that sent out doctors to help the problems of medical deprivation in emerging countries, including in Africa. The scientific journals of Cuba were multitudinous. That side of the revolution is often not appreciated and certainly not always incorporated in the way that African leaders of a liberation generation think appropriate for going forward. It requires in itself an educated background in order to appreciate what is required by way of going forward. And something almost missing entirely from political debate in today's Africa. So these things become, as I say, key. You can't have a decolonization without modernity. A contradiction, but can it be bridged? There are ingenious, creative ways of bridging it, which demand, in the first instance, that one's thought is expressed in equal terms, and that means in terms of equal complexity, to the thought of those regarded as the colonizing powers of the past. One does not repudiate, one overcomes, one becomes equal, hopefully one becomes superior. That's a very, very big ask. It also means that one takes responsibility and basically ends things to do with impunity as well as dependence. As my colleague Phil Clark has said, no good complaining about the International Criminal Court if there's no African Criminal Court. If you can't do it yourself, and you should do it yourself, why complain about others and the way that they seek to do it? So questions of justice, constitutional provision for justice, continental-wide provision for justice, all of these things together with guarantees for a modern concept of human rights, but applying to all of Africa, perhaps using African philosophical modalities to express it. And my PhD student, Alice Mokwe, is researching that right now in Botswana and demonstrating it is in fact possible to have a very, very complex view articulated in a complex way of exactly what human rights entail. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the way forward into the future. It's a much bigger challenge than what one imagines. The great Zambian and African book that last year hugely impressed American literary audiences was by the Zambian author Namwali Sepel. In fact, I knew Namwali when she was a little girl, and she's grown now into a Harvard professor and also a very significant novelist. And the book, the best-selling book, is entitled The Old Drift. And it begins with a very, very unusual experiment in Zambia. That is very shortly after independence. Independence came in 1964. It came basically in the middle of the space race between the two superpowers of the day, United States and the USSR, the Soviet Union. And the thought by some regarded as crazy in Zambia was, why can't we also take part in the space race? Now, it seems crazy in retrospect, and Time magazine certainly thought it was a little bit at least eccentric. It wasn't so impolite to say this is mad, this is just African dreaming without any kind of substance. In fact, the entrepreneur behind it did his best to improvise an equivalent to the kind of training that astronauts received in the United States. It wasn't successful, of course, but what was meaningful about this, and this is what is portrayed throughout Namwali's book, is the aspiration to be modern on one's own terms. The Old Drift is about the history of the country trying to be modern, trying to be equal, but doing so on one's own terms and not afraid to attempt this, no matter how apparently laughably, in a complex scientific field. That's the challenge, to combine all of these aspects of the future, as well as the pride within the country, which all the same can only decolonize as far as the advent of Christianity in Zambia. And not just Christianity that's become the state religion and indeed the constitutional, as it were, foundation for the nature of the state, but all kinds of things that may be regarded as traditional, but which are in fact not. In Shima, a form of polenta using maize meal, is the staple food. It goes by different names in different parts of Southern Africa. Sansa in Zimbabwe, for instance. Form of polenta, as I said, and it was introduced by the colonizing powers as a cheap way of feeding laborers and was therefore adopted as a staple food. You go to Zambia, you buy traditional costume, material, the wrap skirt, the chitenge, which is what it's called, beautiful prints. You wrap it around you, you tie it at the waist, and it's regarded as an expression of authentic traditional femalehood in Zambia. Well, that again was introduced by the missionaries as a means of modesty for local women. Yet all of these things were adopted incorporated into an adjusted incorporating society, turning it into society's own, making it so clearly inalienable from local society that it's regarded essentially as traditional. No one questions it. And yet it was a successful incorporation of things taken from the outside. Also in Zambia, what you have is the United Church of Zambia. I've mentioned this before. A hugely ecumenical organization to which all Christian religions are able to belong, from the Catholic Church to the most charismatic Baptist and Pentecostal church. It doesn't impose a single liturgy or a single doctrine. There are diverse Christian doctrines, of course, many syncretic ones that really don't make much sense in terms of Western Christianity. They're all very much there on equal terms. It's this equality globally that Africa should aim for. Ambition, yes. Vision, oh yes. Is it just decolonial? No, it's not. It's inventing something way beyond anything that colonialism could achieve. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this course.